Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're happy you could join us. My name is Naya Hyde, and I'm the Marketing Assistant for K-12 Education Products here at Brooks Publishing. Before we start, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. You'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box. We'll take these questions after the Q&A portion of the webinar. For the presentation, you also might want to minimize the GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of your screen. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of the control bar. If you need to enlarge the bar again to ask a question, you can just click the orange button again. If you experience any audio issues at any point, you can switch to phone by clicking in the audio section of the webinar panel and using the dial-in information provided. Also, we are recording this webinar. Everyone who registered for the event will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. All live attendees will also receive their certificate of attendance in follow-up email tomorrow as well. During today's presentation, Nancy Hennessy will reference content from her book, The Reading Comprehension Blueprint, Helping Students Make Meaning from Text. This book will offer a clear blueprint for understanding the complexities of reading comprehension and delivering high-quality, evidence-based instruction that helps students construct meaning from challenging text. Aligned with the science of reading and IDA's structured literacy approach, this book is a must for in-service educators and an ideal supplement to pair with core literacy textbooks. Today's teachers will get the essential knowledge and practical tools they need to help every student become a proficient reader and build a strong foundation for school success. To learn more about the book, you can visit the URL shown on your screen. I'm also happy to announce that Brooks will be giving away 3 copies of Nancy Hennessy's forthcoming book, The Reading Comprehension Blueprint. Winners will be randomly selected from today's live attendees and notified by email after the webinar. Winners will receive their copy after the book publishes. To increase your chances, be sure to submit your questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. Without further delay, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. Nancy Hennessy is an experienced educator who currently works as a literacy consultant. She is a past president of the International Dyslexia Association. Nancy has worked across grade levels K-12 with both general and special educators. While in public schools, she provided leadership in the development of innovative curriculum for special needs students, a statewide revision of Special Education Code, and led a state-of-the-art professional development program for all teachers. Nancy has delivered keynote addresses, multiple virtual and live workshops, and training courses on various topics, including skilled reading, writing, and dyslexia. She has developed in-depth professional development on the science of reading and informed instruction for the AIM Institute of Learning and Research, and on dyslexia for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. Nancy authored Working with Meaning, Vocabulary Instruction in Multi-Sensory Teaching of Basic Skills, 4th edition, and co-authored Letters, Digging for Meaning, Teaching Text Comprehension, the 2nd edition, with Louisa Moat. Most recently, she has focused on delivering virtual and in-person professional learning opportunities on reading comprehension. Nancy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and I want to welcome all of you who have signed on today and those of you who will be watching this at a future date. I'm most appreciative of the opportunity to share knowledge with other individuals who are interested in student success. Today, we're going to do a bit of a comprehension checkup. It's time to extract and construct meaning specific to the comprehension construct today. So with that in mind, I want you to take just a moment to consider some of these important factors or components of comprehension. So let's do a mental checkup. Let's think a little bit about how much you know about each of these different bits of knowledge, where you might want to improve your knowledge, add to your knowledge, elaborate on what it is that you already know. So comprehension is one of the most complex behaviors our students engage in daily. It involves a range of language and cognitive processes that students must master to make sense of written text. Comprehension processes are necessary to create comprehension products. Multiple factors influence extracting and constructing meaning, including the reader, the text, task, and the context. And of course, last but not least, informed instructional environments depend upon your knowledge, the educator's knowledge, and your ability to implement practice that is reflective of the science of reading. Now, of course, I did this little bit of a checkup with you with a dual purpose in mind. First of all, to get you thinking about what you know and what you might want to learn more about, but also for you to surface your background knowledge, to get the mental Velcro going so that as we have a discussion about comprehension today, you can make connections. So let's begin by thinking about the fact that comprehension is complex from the perspective of the student. I want you to be thinking about what are the demands that we currently place upon our students in our classrooms, through our curriculum, when we think about the standards that we're asking for them to achieve. And if we think a bit about the kinds of questions or the type of tasks that we're asking our students to participate in, I think we quickly realize that we've moved from expecting shallow to deep comprehension. So consider Antonio in first grade who's listening to the Velveteen Rabbit. And we ask him, when a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. What do you think this means? Or when we ask Kayla in third grade, who's reading The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy, right, which appears in a National Geographic or appears on a National Geographic site, why were the archaeologists surprised when they discovered the mummy? By the way, the mummy was female. Or Matt, who's reading Tuck Everlasting. Would you want to be immortal? Why or why not? A major theme of that particular book. Or Lily, who's in ninth grade, who's reading Animal Farm. In what ways does this fable serve as a condemnation of Soviet communism? I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it that the student, the reader, has to bring to the text, to the task, in order to be successful at producing a product demonstrating their understanding? So from this perspective, we can begin to think about the complicated construct of comprehension. But let's go a little further with this. If I were to ask you to define comprehension, I'm wondering what might come to mind for you. Very often when I work with educators, their response has to do with product. In other words, what is it that the student is able to do in order to demonstrate that they understand the text? And I think this is natural because very much of our instruction is focused on our students' ability to actually work with text and to show us that they can make meaning of the text. But I think we have to keep in mind that comprehension demands construction. And when we think about the construction of comprehension, we have to think about what do we have to do in order to be able to demonstrate that understanding. And so a review of different definitions of comprehension begin to yield for us this understanding that processes yield product, that we can't have a quality product without having quality processes. And in fact, a number of researchers, when they think about comprehension, talk about the fact not only that comprehension is complex, but why it is complex. Because it involves a range of language and cognitive processes and skills that the students must master in order to make sense of the written text. Now, this is common when we begin to think about other definitions. For instance, the Rand Reading Study Group talks about comprehension as being a process that allows us to extract and construct meaning. The NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Proficiency, also defines comprehension in this way, talking about it being an active process. At the same time, it does attend to the fact that those active processes that we engage in yield product. And in fact, researchers such as Castles and her colleagues talk about the fact that comprehension is not a single entity, that it is this orchestrated product that is the result of using linguistic and cognitive processes. So this is pretty complicated already. And if you hadn't thought about comprehension in this way, I want you to begin to think about the fact that in order to have a quality product, we have to have quality processes. So the next question obviously is, well, then what are those processes? If we in fact are responsible for teaching our students, we're responsible for developing those processes, what are they, right? So let's move on and talk a little bit about language comprehension and language comprehension processes. This will look familiar to many of you. Of course, this is Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, and it's a metaphor for thinking about skilled reading. And in fact, she defines skilled reading for us. She says it's the fluent execution and coordination of text comprehension and word recognition. Our focus today is not word recognition, not because we don't deem it critical, we do. It's absolutely essential. We want our students to be able to read the words that are presented to them on page. And when we think about the simple view of reading, Goff and Tummer's simple view that explains reading comprehension, one critical factor, of course, is word recognition. That's represented here on the reading rope. And what Hollis has told us is that there are certain strands that are essential in order for students to become proficient at word recognition. But she also speaks to us about the fact that in order to understand the words that we find in print, that we have to have in place language comprehension. We have to have strong oral language foundations, right, proficiencies, that we can use then to move to written text. Now, what are those strands that make up language comprehension? Well, she speaks to us about the importance of background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, which are defined both as semantic and syntactic structures. I want you to think a little bit about sentence comprehension here. Verbal reasoning. I want you to think about different levels of understanding, moving from shallow to deep understanding of text. And then literacy and print knowledge. I want you to think about text structures, for instance. Initially with young children, learning that print represents the thoughts, the words, that we move from left to right, and then eventually thinking about different discourse structures or genre. Note that the strands of the rope, both for the lower strands and the upper strands, need to be tightly woven together, right, and over time, right, with increasing experience and instruction so that the student becomes a skilled reader. Again, our focus, the top strands of the rope, the language comprehension strands, because if comprehension is complex, then we have to be thinking about, well, what processes do we need to develop so that the student becomes skillful? And here it also talks or speaks to becoming increasingly strategic. Although it doesn't specifically mean the use of strategy, all right, what Hollis intended here was that the student be very purposeful, that they have set goals, that they monitor their comprehension, their understanding, and that they are flexible and adapt as they need to in order to accomplish what that goal might be. Now, I do want to say to you that as we think about these language processes, about the language comprehension, that Hollis developed these, first of all, based on those two factors that we find in the simple view of reading, Goff and Tummer's simple view, word recognition and language comprehension. But she also did a meta-analysis of many, many studies that have been done related to how we might go about predicting what are the factors that predict whether a student will be able or will have difficulty with reading early on. And so the strands of the rope, both under word recognition and language comprehension, are based very much solidly in research. Okay. So language comprehension strands, let's just talk a little bit more about these and how they relate to what it is that the reader has to be able to do when they come to text. So both Kate Kane, Jane Oakhill, other researchers like Hugh Katz have spoken to the importance of language or language processing in terms of comprehension. So when the reader comes to text, they have to deal with vocabulary, one of the strands of the rope. And Kate Kane has articulated for us these different levels of language processing by saying, you know what, the reader has to be able to make meaning of the words. And as our students come to text, particularly as they move through the grades, they have to make meaning of what we call academic vocabulary. So more sophisticated language, the language of school, the language of the standards that we find in text. Kate Kane and others also have told us that they have to figure out the syntactic structures of the sentences, and then they also have to think about how the sentences relate to one another, right? How we can think about meanings within and between the sentences. In order to do that, they have to work with sentences that are dense, have many ideas, that are long, different sentence structures, right? And they also have to be thinking about, well, what ties up meaning within and between those sentences? Cohesive ties and connectives. Additionally, as they move through the text, Kate Kane and others have told us, they need to be integrating their background knowledge, right, with the words that the author has provided so that they understand what is below the surface of the text so that they can make meaning of the text at a deeper level. They can understand what's implied. And in order to do that, they have to bring their schema, their specific background knowledge as it relates to the topic or the themes that they're reading about. They also have to bring with them their knowledge of text structure. That actually is a specialized type of background knowledge. And they have to make imprints, all right, both on a local level, what we call a local level, at the sentence level, and at the overall text level. You cannot infer without background knowledge. Now, you may have noticed that the arrows are bidirectional because what's happening is, as a student comes to text, they're aggregating meaning. They're bringing together these units of meaning, these idea units, and they're aggregating them and building what we hope is a coherent representation of text. In other words, everything in the text hangs together and it makes sense to them. They work with the surface code, that's the exact words and the syntax that the author has provided. They work at the text space, that's the implied meanings where they're integrating their background knowledge. And hopefully the result then is what we call a situation or mental model, which is this overall representation of the text that they can take with them to other texts in the future, other learning in the future that has similar themes, understandings required, and so on. Right? So, levels of language processing. Now, you might have noted when I described comprehension, I said that it involved processing not only with language, but also cognitive processes. And individuals such as Judith Irwin have elaborated further on this, saying that as they work through these various levels of language processing, they're working with kind of the micro units of meaning, right? So they're processing the words in the sentences, they're integrating, so integrative processes are occurring, the meanings within and between the sentences. They're elaborating, they're bringing forward their background knowledge. They're being metacognitive, so metacognitive processes, monitoring their comprehension. And ultimately, they're doing this macro processing, right, of the overall text. So complex, to say the least. All right. We also want to be thinking about the fact that it's not just the reader that influences the making of meaning. So certainly, when the reader comes to text, what they bring, hopefully, are those language and cognitive processes we've been talking about, as well as, attention and motivation, executive functioning, and so on. So there's a few other things we could be talking about as well here that influence their comprehension, but we've talked primarily about the principal influences. But the book, such as Tuck Everlasting, the text is also going to influence their levels of understanding. So we all know that texts can be demanding in different ways, that the complexity of a text is determined by the vocabulary that's used, the syntactic structures, the cohesion, whether or not the ideas actually hang together in an understandable way, right? And so the nature of the text also influences what happens with comprehension. as does the task or the purpose, right? So if I say to my student, respond to the following questions based on your reading of Tuck Everlasting, the student has to set a purpose. They have to understand what it is that's required of them. And we can ask questions that range from literal to inferential. Also, the context. And so in the lower right-hand corner, we have the teacher working with his students, right? You are the context. The educator is the context. Now, there's a broader context in terms of the classroom, the school district, the culture in which the child lives. But first and foremost, the education, the instruction that the student receives is going to influence these levels of comprehension, or is going to influence the product that the student is capable of producing. So the student's ability to extract and construct to then demonstrate understanding that product depends upon their access to and implementation of specific processes and skills. But this also will be influenced by the nature of the text, the task, content, and by what the reader has acquired, right, and can access. That comes directly from the RAND Reading Study Group report that relates to what we know or what we knew at that particular time and what we continue to learn about comprehension. So I'm checking these off as we go. All right. So of course, we want to then make connections to instruction, and I've begun to do that already for you. But if we were again to return to and look at the comprehension strands, the language comprehension strands, we could talk about what are the instructional components that connect. And I briefly did that for you when we were working with the rope. So background knowledge, but particularly when we think about a particular text, the specific background knowledge that's necessary to understand a text. And vocabulary, thinking about how we go about choosing the vocabulary we'll be teaching our students. Sentence comprehension, because to make sense out of the sentences, we have to understand how sentences work, right? And then varied levels of understanding, including inference, and then of course, literacy knowledge being print awareness or text structures. So you see a comprehension house here, and it's resting on our students walking away with critical understandings, but our students are learning from what it is that we're reading. And we see that the primary supports here are vocabulary and background knowledge, because we know while all of this is critical, they play especially critical roles in the construction of meaning. And then we have other supports that reflect these different instructional components. So what's a teacher to do? Well, you know, when I begin to think about comprehension, and I used to think about it this way, I tended to think about a lesson plan or a text that my student was reading or a series of questions, but we know that comprehension is much more than that. And the reality is, if we're going to develop these competencies within our students, then we need a blueprint for constructing comprehension. And so what I've developed over a number of years is a reading comprehension blueprint. It's a master plan. It's not a lesson plan. It's not a unit organizer. It's a master plan or a framework that addresses both process and product demands. It helps you as the educator to organize and scaffold the preparation of text for varied purposes, because we read text, whether it's informational or narrative text, for different purposes. It calls for the use of evidence-based strategies and activities. I certainly think that strategies are important, but strategies need to serve specific purposes. So not all strategies created equal. Right? It also allows for flexibility based on the text, the student, and the context. And it acknowledges the metacognitive nature of teaching. Each of us as educators have had the experience of planning for, delivering, and having had to adjust. And we do that by consistently asking ourselves questions about how we go about designing and delivering our instruction. So here's the blueprint. Now, oftentimes in working with educators, I'll say this. Remember, it's not a lesson plan. Remember, it's not even a unit organizer. You can't take it all on at once. But as you think about the different texts that you're identifying or the texts that are identified in your curriculum, you need to be thinking about opportunities for developing these different language and cognitive processes. So it poses a series of questions based on, to the left, you see the very components of the blueprint. To the right, you see a series of questions that have everything to do with instruction. And the questions are based on what we've learned from the evidence, from the research about instruction. So to the left, preparing for instruction, there are questions that relate to what do you want your students to take away from this text? What are the critical understandings? Right? What's the purpose for reading? What's the content purpose? What's the learning? What are the literacy purposes? What language processes and skills will you be developing? And then for text reading, it addresses each of those strands of the rope that we were just talking about and poses a series of questions. I'm going to delve into vocabulary in a moment. So let me just read to you very quickly the questions that are posed here. Which words will your students need to know? Which are worth knowing? You can't teach everything. Which words will you intentionally target and directly teach? Which ones will you incidentally on purpose teach? How and when? Which words will you purposely discuss, incorporate into expressive language activities? How and when will you teach and foster the use of independent word learning strategies? Those questions directly relate to the approaches that we know are most effective in terms of teaching vocabulary. Please note there's also a bidirectional arrow here. And the bidirectional arrow tells you that any one of these areas, the strategies and activities that you're using, can be done before, during, or after reading. That's up to you, there's flexibility here. Also, the strategies and activities that you choose, while they should be aligned with the evidence, those are up to you. The intensity is up to you. The other part of this that you see represented on the bidirectional arrow is comprehension monitoring, because we want our students to be consistently asking themselves, we want to teach them how to ask themselves whether or not what they're doing is making sense. Are they accomplishing their goals? Right? Time does not allow for me to delve into each of these language structures, knowledge, levels of understanding, expression of understanding. I just would invite you to do that afterwards. So let me share them with you, the informed instructional framework that then aligns with the questions that you just saw represented for vocabulary. And when you begin to think about vocabulary instruction, I will tell you that the literature tells us that there are four approaches that we should be using in terms of vocabulary instruction. 1, intentional and direct. 2, indirect, or what I call incidental on purpose. 3, intentional independent word learning strategies. And underlying all of that, this awareness of the importance of words, how words help us to communicate thought, even having some fun with words, in other words, word consciousness. Now, I'm not going to delve deeply into each of these columns, but I will say this to you. Each of these columns surfaces for you those things that you need to be thinking about in order to accomplish instruction in these multiple ways. For example, for direct or intentional instruction, you need to be thinking about word choice. Is the word useful? Will it promote growth? Is it important to the understanding of the text? Principles of instruction. When we provide instruction to our students, we have to provide them with definition, with contextual information, and with multiple opportunities to process and interact with the word. And that then leads to instructional routines. A routine in which the student learns about the phonology, the orthography, and the meaning of the word, along with its syntactical role. And then to go further, because multiple exposures are needed for a deep understanding of word knowledge, processing and practice activities that allow for the students to make connections to the words, semantic connections, semantic maps, for instance, that allow for the students to represent word meaning, visuals, that allow for the students to use words, prompts, or stems. Now, one of the things that I've not mentioned is I firmly believe that as we work with our students developing these language processes, developing comprehension, we need to be using age and grade appropriate texts. Texts that reflect the academic language that our students will need in order to succeed. And that oftentimes our instruction, right, our activities are going to be anchored in that text. So the words that I'm talking about that you would choose would come directly from text. Time does not allow for me to speak much more about incidental on purpose, other than the fact that our students learn many words indirectly, and there are multiple ways that we, and this is specific to us as educators, can provide opportunities for this incidental learning. And thirdly, that oftentimes our students are going to encounter words when we're not there, when their parents are not there, and we need to teach them ways to infer meaning of word from context, as well as by teaching them about common morphemes, Latin roots, for instance. All right. So the blueprint overall is designed to support you, the educator, as you use your knowledge, this deep knowledge hopefully, to identify your learning goals, to set your purpose, to organize your instruction, to select your activities, and then to monitor student progress. I haven't talked a great deal about assessment here, but I believe that informal classroom assessment plays a major role in knowing whether or not you're succeeding in developing these language processes and skills. So I would invite you to think about your current practices and whether or not those are adequate. Are they sufficient to help your students construct the comprehension house that we see here? So we've come to the end of our discussion, but I thought we should just return to our comprehension checkup. I know this has been brief. My hope is that we're able to make connections and perhaps to even check off for yourself. Whoops, sorry, did not mean to move on. Whoa, went way too fast. Here we go. To check off some of these critical factors or these bits of knowledge. So hopefully you have a deeper or better understanding, or this reaffirmed for you that comprehension is complex, that it involves a range of processes, and those processes are critical in order for our students to produce product. So that's the next one. Quality processes end up or result in, I should say, quality products. That there are multiple factors that we need to consider here, not just the language processes and skills, the cognitive processes, but also what the reader knows, all right, what the text demands, what the purpose is, and then most importantly, what your instruction looks like. And that informed instructional environments always depend upon what we bring to the task, our experiences, but our knowledge and our ability to implement practices that reflect the science of reading. All right, so I think, Naya, it's time to take some questions, and I think I've used quite a bit of time, so let's see if we can just take a little bit more time to see if we can respond to some questions.
Perfect. That was a great presentation, Nancy. We got a lot of great questions. Thanks again to everyone for submitting your questions. If you do continue to have questions, feel free to put them in the questions pane. We can try to get to them. All right, so we'll start with this question. How do we get teachers away from teaching comprehension as isolated skills?
Yeah. Oh, that's a wonderful question, and it really relates to everything that I was just talking about. I think it has to do with understanding what comprehension actually is, and that's why I spend so much time talking about a definition that is probably somewhat different than one that we've experienced. Isolated skills that are not applicable directly to text does not accomplish a goal for us. I think we have to start with this understanding that the purpose of comprehension is learning, right? And if we begin with text, we can establish clear goals for learning and then think through what's it going to take for our students to actually walk away and be able to do some of those things that the standards demand or that our curriculum demands.
Okay, thank you.
Not a workbook. Thank you for asking the question. It's not a workbook.
The second question we got, if the reader's background knowledge is weak, will the reader be able to make sense of the text?
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful question. Okay, so one of the things that I directly addressed in the book, one of the chapters, has to do with the building of background knowledge. So I think oftentimes we ask our students what it is that they know about a particular topic. Well, we can begin there, but then if they don't know enough, then we have to identify what's critical to the understanding, and then we need to build. So I talk about the ABCs of background knowledge, this activation, but also this building, and we can build in so many different ways, and we don't have to spend days and days building as long as we understand what the critical topics are that we want our students to walk away with. And of course, some students will come with more background knowledge than others, and we need to be cognizant of that. Hence the flexibility in terms of how much or how little we need to do for our students. The other thing I want to say is that I'm very much in favor of, as I said, using age and grade appropriate texts, but I believe that we should be using texts that have similar themes or topics so that students are able to connect and continually build on this basic knowledge that they have about a particular topic.
And so building that knowledge is really important.
Yes,
That's
it's
awesome.
absolutely critical. You can't make meaning of text at a deep level if you don't have background knowledge. You'll only make meaning at what I call that surface code. Well, it's not; those are not my words, but the surface code. Yeah.
Another question, what role does strategy instruction play in the blueprint?
Yeah. Well, the strategy instruction runs throughout the blueprint, all right? But what one has to think about is, when the question gets asked, what strategies and activities will help you to develop an understanding of word meaning, or what strategies or activities will help you be able to answer a question on an inferential level. One has to identify the strategy or activity that's specific to that purpose. I like strategies very much, but they're not the be all and the end all. Oftentimes I'll say, for instance, in order to answer inferential questions, you can teach strategies till the cows come home, but if the student doesn't have background knowledge, if they don't have that language background, they're not going to be able to deal with an inferential question. So they play a role, all right, and strategies made automatic are skills, all right, not my saying, Danielle McNamara. But they play a role from the perspective of what does the evidence tell us is the most effective way to go about developing these processes and skills.
Great response. Another question, what types of texts are most appropriate for developing comprehension skills?
Yeah, well, I believe age and grade appropriate text and different genre. So both narrative and informational text. So thinking about if you have an opportunity to choose your text for young children, for instance, as you're developing word recognition, you want to be choosing text for read alouds that develop academic language, all right? If you're working with older students, you want to be thinking about what are the critical understandings, maybe that even run across disciplines that will allow for you to develop, this kind of deep knowledge base. I'm very much about, and in the book, with the help of some wonderful educators, we give some examples of unit organizers that are developed around critical questions, enduring understandings, and then the choice of multiple texts, both narrative and informational texts that would help you develop that. So for instance, around 3rd or 4th grade, you might be thinking about developing critical understandings around what is a revolutionary, kind of an essential question, enduring understanding to understand revolutionaries or activists. And you can begin with a text like Dear Benjamin Banneker, Rosa Parks, and so on, multiple texts then that feed into this, if you have that opportunity. If not, be thinking about the text that you're using and how they can connect with one another.
Oh, perfect. Here's some good examples there. So I think we have time for one more question. How do you recommend first-year teachers navigate the blueprint?
Oh, a little bit at a time. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking me that, because oftentimes when I'm working with teachers, whether they're first-year teachers or experienced teachers, I will say to them, how do you eat an elephant? I don't like that expression, but it fits here. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So you can't take this all on all at once. Start with vocabulary for sure, all right, and background knowledge. I'm not saying the others aren't important, but you know, choose something that you know will begin to get you thinking more and more about the development of these other processes. They are interrelated. When I talked about the strands, I don't know that I said this on the reading rope, but while they can exist independently, and this relates back to isolated skills, nothing is isolated. Everything is dependent upon something else, but they're interwoven, they're interrelated, and if any one of the strands is frayed, then comprehension is going to be in jeopardy. But anyway, but start in one area. Go one bite at a time.
Right, step by step.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Nancy, for those great responses. I want to just remind everyone that if you're interested in learning more about Nancy's book, if you could click the next, perfect, the Reading Comprehension Blueprint, you can be sure to visit the URL on the screen. This book will publish later this year, and it's also currently available for pre-order on bookspublishing.com.
Yeah.
I'd also like to share that we are offering 20% off on our products, including Nancy's book, The Reading Comprehension Blueprint, through the end of June. So anyone who watches this webinar or the recording can use the code COFFEETALK to receive this discount at checkout. And then if you're looking for more professional development opportunities like this webinar over the coming weeks, you can be sure to visit Books Publishing website for the latest addition to our Coffee Chat series. We're hosting chats every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with our esteemed authors, and we would love for you all to join us. And again, thanks to everyone who attended. We really appreciate you guys sending in all these questions. And then Nancy, just again, thank you for your time in this great presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone. Thanks for the support from Brooks for offering these, and for everyone who took the time today and in the future.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great day.